Welcome to Reality Stories Hub. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. You know that moment when your whole world shifts and you realize the person you've been living with is a complete stranger? That's what happened to me on a cold February night in Chicago. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what happened and what I did about it. I'd been married to David for 7 years. 7 years of standing beside him while he built his real estate empire from the ground up. He owned half the luxury apartment buildings in downtown Chicago, and everyone knew his name. David Sterling, the king of Chicago property. That's what the newspapers called him. Me. I was just his wife, the woman who smiled in the background of his success photos. That night, David told me we were going to an important dinner meeting. He said it casually, like he was asking me to pick up milk from the store. "We're something nice," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "But not too nice. You know what I mean?" I stood in our bedroom for almost an hour, staring at my closet. I chose a simple navy dress, nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention. Because that's what I'd learned to do over the years. Blend in. Be there, but not really there. The restaurant was one of those places where everything costs more than it should, and the lights are dim enough that you can pretend you're more important than you really are. It was called the Pinnacle, perched on the 42nd floor with views of the entire city glittering below like scattered diamonds. When I arrived, David was already seated at a large table surrounded by investors, business partners, and people whose opinions mattered to him. And right there, sitting so close to him that their shoulders touched, was Jessica. Jessica was his new assistant. 26 years old, blonde hair that looked professionally done every single day, and a laugh that could cut through any conversation in the room. She wore a red dress that night. Bright red. The kind that screamed, "Look at me." When she saw me approaching, she smiled. But it wasn't a real smile. It was the kind of smile a cat gives a mouse right before the pounce. "Oh, you must be Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice dripping with sweetness that felt like poison. "David talks about you sometimes." "Sometimes. Not often. Sometimes." I smiled back and took my seat at the far end of the table, the spot reserved for people who don't really matter. The dinner felt endless. I watched David laugh at Jessica's jokes, the same jokes he used to roll his eyes at when I told them. I watched him pour wine into her glass first, then everyone else's, while my glass sat empty and ignored. Every small gesture was a message. You're not important anymore. But I stayed quiet. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I nodded when I was supposed to nod. I played the role of the perfect wife. Then came the soup course. French onion soup, steaming hot in those fancy ceramic bowls that are impossible to hold properly. Jessica leaned toward me with that same cat-like smile. "Oh my goodness," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I'm so clumsy today." And just like that, she tilted her bowl. Hot soup poured across the table and splashed directly onto my lap and arm. The heat was immediate and brutal, burning through the fabric of my dress and searing my skin. The entire table went silent. Not the kind of concerned silence where people rushed to help. No, this was the uncomfortable silence of people who know something wrong just happened, but don't want to get involved. I heard a few gasps. Someone whispered, "Oh no." Another person gave a nervous laugh. But the worst part? The absolute worst part was David's face. He wasn't concerned. He wasn't angry at Jessica. He was smirking. Actually smirking, like this was the funniest thing he'd seen all week. He didn't hand me a napkin. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just sat there with that smirk carved across his face, and in that moment, I understood everything. This wasn't an accident. This was a test. A public display to show everyone at that table exactly where I stood in his world. Nowhere. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see what I would do. Would I cry? Would I yell? Would I make a scene that they could gossip about for weeks? I stood up slowly. My arm was throbbing, my dress was ruined, and my pride was screaming at me to do something, anything. But instead, I smiled. Not at Jessica. Not at David. I smiled at myself, at the woman I was about to become. "Excuse me," I said calmly, my voice steady and clear. "I need to freshen up." I walked to the restroom with my head high, every step controlled, every breath measured. I didn't run. I didn't stumble. I walked like a queen leaving her throne. Inside the restroom, I locked the door and looked at myself in the mirror. My arm was red and angry, my dress was stained, and my hands were shaking. But something else was happening too. Something deep inside me that had been sleeping for years was waking up. I wasn't broken. I was angry. And anger, when it's cold and controlled, is far more powerful than any scream. That night, standing in that restroom with burned skin and a ruined dress, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight back with tears or confrontation. I was going to do something far more effective. I was going to let them destroy themselves, and I was going to make sure the whole world was watching when they did. The morning after that dinner felt strange. The house was too quiet, like the calm before a storm that everyone knows is coming but no one wants to mention. David came downstairs around 8, dressed in his usual designer suit, phone already glued to his hand. He poured himself coffee, scrolled through his emails, and acted like absolutely nothing had happened the night before. "No, are you okay?" "No, I'm sorry." Not even a glance at the burn mark on my arm that I hadn't bothered to cover up. "You're up early," he said without looking at me. I was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. I'd barely slept. My mind had been racing all night, thinking, planning, understanding. "I couldn't sleep," I replied simply. He nodded, barely hearing me. "Last night went well," he said, a slight smile on his face. "Jessica really impressed the investors. She's got a good head for this business." The way he said her name made something twist in my chest. But I didn't react. I just took a sip of my cold tea and said, "Yes, she certainly made an impression." He didn't catch the meaning behind my words. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. Either way, that was the moment I realized something important. I didn't need to argue with him. I didn't need to beg him to see me or value me or remember who I used to be to him. The most powerful thing I could do was stop fighting altogether. Because silence, real silence, makes people uncomfortable in ways that screaming never can. For the next few weeks, I became a ghost in my own home. I cooked his meals. I kept the house perfect. I showed up to his business events in nice dresses with a polite smile. But I stopped asking questions. I stopped waiting up for him. I stopped caring about where he went or who he was with. And that's when I started really paying attention. I watched how he moved through the world, who he talked to, who mattered to him, who had power over his reputation. David's entire empire was built on image. People invested in his buildings because they believed in him, in his success story, in the idea that he was someone worth trusting. But image is fragile. It only takes a few cracks before the whole thing shatters. Jessica had become a permanent fixture in his life. She showed up at every event, every meeting, every photo opportunity. She'd hang on his arm like a designer handbag, laughing too loud, talking too much, acting like she owned the place. At first, people were charmed by her. Young, beautiful, confident. But I noticed something else. I noticed the way other women looked at her, the way investors' wives whispered when she walked by, the way David's longtime business partners seemed uncomfortable when she spoke out of turn in meetings. She was making mistakes, small ones that she didn't even realize. And David was too distracted to see it. So I started planting seeds. Little ones. Tiny comments dropped in the right conversations with the right people. At a charity luncheon, I sat next to Mrs. Patterson, one of David's oldest investors' wives. She was a sharp woman in her 60s who'd seen every trick in the book. "Jessica seems very ambitious," I said casually, stirring my tea. Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow. "Ambitious?" I smiled softly. "Oh, I just mean she's very eager to be involved in everything. David has always been so generous with his trust. I just hope people appreciate that about him." I didn't say anything bad. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I just planted a tiny seed of doubt. And I did this everywhere. With investors, with social contacts, with journalists who came to David's events. I never spoke with anger or bitterness. I was always graceful, always concerned, always the worried wife who just wanted the best for her husband. Jessica is lovely, but sometimes I worry she might be moving too fast. David is so kind to give her so much responsibility. I hope it doesn't overwhelm her. She's very confident. Maybe too confident for someone so new to this world. Each comment was like dropping a pebble in water. Small ripples that spread wider and wider. And people started talking. Not because I told them to, but because I gave them permission to voice the doubts they'd already been feeling. Within a month, the whispers had begun. Investors started questioning David's judgment. Why was his assistant at board meetings? Why was she speaking for him in public? Was he losing his professional edge? Even the media started picking up on it. Small comments in business columns, subtle hints in society pages. Nothing major, nothing David could point to and fight against. Just questions. Meanwhile, at home, things were falling apart between him and Jessica. I could hear them arguing on the phone late at night. Her voice would get high and panicked, his would get cold and angry. People are talking, Jessica. You need to be more careful. You said they respected me. They respect what I tell them to respect. I listened to these fights from the other room, and I didn't feel happy or victorious. I just felt calm. Because I knew the truth. I wasn't destroying them. They were destroying themselves. I was just making sure everyone else could see it happening. I started attending social events again. Not as David's shadow, but as myself. I went to charity meetings, gallery openings, fundraisers. I spoke with grace and dignity about everything except my marriage. And people noticed. They saw a woman who'd been publicly humiliated, but never fought back. A woman who carried herself with quiet strength while her husband paraded his mistake around town. Slowly, their sympathy shifted. I became the symbol of dignity. And Jessica? She became the symbol of everything people don't respect. Desperation, overconfidence, poor judgment. The narrative was changing, and I hadn't said a single cruel word. By the time spring arrived, David's perfect world was starting to crumble, and he couldn't figure out why. His phone rang less. Investors who used to return his calls within hours suddenly took days to respond. A major deal he'd been working on for months fell through because the other party decided to go with a different developer. No explanation, just a polite email saying they were going in a different direction. I watched him pace the living room night after night, phone pressed to his ear, trying to salvage business relationships that were quietly slipping away. I don't understand, he'd mutter to himself. Everything was fine a month ago. But it wasn't fine. It had never been fine. He just hadn't noticed because he was too busy playing king of his own little empire. Jessica wasn't helping matters. The more desperate she became to prove herself, the worse her decisions got. She started showing up to events she wasn't invited to. She posted photos on social media with captions like "building empires together" and "power couple energy," tagging David in every single one. The comments under those posts were brutal. People weren't holding back anymore. Who is she? That's not his wife. This is embarrassing. Money can't buy class. I never commented. I never even liked or shared anything. But I watched, and I saw how public opinion was turning against them like a tide going out. One evening, I hosted a small dinner party at our house. Nothing fancy, just 8 women I'd known for years through charity work and social circles. Women who mattered in Chicago society. Women whose opinions carried weight. We sat in the dining room, the same dining room where David used to host his victory dinners, and we talked. Not about him, not about Jessica, but about life, about strength, about what it means to hold your head high when the world expects you to break. One of the women, Patricia, looked at me with kind eyes and said, "You're stronger than anyone I know. After everything, you're still here, still graceful." I smiled softly. What else can you do? Life goes on. Another woman, Linda, shook her head. I would have burned his whole world down. Burning things down is easy, I said quietly. But there's something more powerful about standing still and watching people destroy themselves. Fire gets attention, but silence? Silence makes people nervous. They nodded, understanding something I'd learned the hard way. Revenge doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes the quietest response is the one that echoes the longest. Word of that dinner spread. Not because anyone gossiped, but because those women left my home with a different story to tell. A story about a woman who didn't need to fight dirty because she had something better, dignity. Meanwhile, David's stress was turning into paranoia. He started accusing Jessica of saying the wrong things at meetings. She'd accuse him of not defending her enough. Their relationship, which had started as a thrill, was now becoming a burden for both of them. One night, I heard them arguing in his office. The door was closed, but voices carry in a quiet house. "You promised me a future," Jessica said, her voice breaking. "You said we'd be together." "I said a lot of things," David shot back. "But you're making this impossible. Every time you open your mouth in public, I have to do damage control. Maybe if you actually supported me." "Support you? I gave you everything. A job, connections, access to my entire world. And you're ruining it." There was a long silence, then I heard her crying. Not the delicate kind of crying that asks for comfort. The messy, angry kind that comes when you realize you've been used. She left the house that night, slamming the door so hard that the windows rattled. David came downstairs an hour later, poured himself a drink, and sat in the dark living room. I watched him from the hallway, this man I'd once loved, now completely alone with the consequences of his choices. He looked up and saw me standing there. "How long have you been there?" he asked, his voice tired. "Long enough," I said simply. He stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time in months, really looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. "You're different," he said. "No," I replied calmly. "I'm just not pretending anymore." He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. What could he say? Sorry. It was too late for that. Explanations? They wouldn't change anything. I turned and walked back upstairs, leaving him alone in the dark with his whiskey and his regrets. The next week, an invitation arrived in the mail. It was embossed, formal, expensive-looking. The Sterling Foundation Annual Gala, it read. Celebrating excellence in real estate development. David's biggest event of the year. The night where he'd stand on stage and accept awards, give speeches, and remind everyone why he was the most successful developer in Chicago. I held the invitation in my hands and smiled. Because I knew something he didn't. I knew that this gala, his night of triumph, was going to be the night everything finally fell apart. And I was going to be there to watch it happen. I called the event coordinator and confirmed my attendance. "Will you be bringing a guest, Mrs. Sterling?" she asked politely. "No," I said. "I'll be coming alone. But I'd like to request something." "Of course. Anything. I'd like to say a few words during the program. Just a short speech. After all, I helped build this foundation too." There was a pause then. "I'll make sure it's arranged." "Thank you," I said. "I promise it will be memorable." The night of the gala arrived with perfect weather, clear skies and a warm breeze that felt almost too peaceful for what was about to happen. I spent the afternoon getting ready, not rushing, just taking my time. I chose a white dress, simple and elegant, the kind that doesn't try too hard but somehow stands out in any room. I wore my hair down, minimal jewelry, natural makeup. I looked like myself, maybe for the first time in years. When I arrived at the venue, the ballroom was already filled with Chicago's most influential people. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, reflecting light off champagne glasses and designer dresses. A string quartet played softly in the corner, while servers moved through the crowd with trays of expensive appetizers that no one really ate. I walked in alone, and I felt the shift in the room immediately. Conversations paused. Heads turned. People who'd been whispering about me for months now saw me standing there, not broken, not bitter, just present. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others smiled nervously, unsure how to act. A few women gave me small nods of respect. David was near the front of the room, surrounded by business partners, wearing his best suit and his most confident smile. And there, standing just a little too close, was Jessica. She wore black this time, maybe trying to look more sophisticated, but she just looked uncomfortable, like she knew she was standing somewhere she didn't belong. When David's eyes met mine across the room, his smile faltered for just a second. I could see the confusion, maybe even fear, flash across his face. He hadn't expected me to come. Or maybe he'd hoped I wouldn't. I gave him the smallest nod, polite and distant, then walked past him like he was just another guest at the party. The evening moved forward with the usual program. Dinner, awards, speeches from people praising David's vision and success. Jessica stood beside him during the presentations, smiling for cameras, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She knew people were watching, judging, talking. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The host, a cheerful man in his 50s who'd been paid well to make everyone feel important, stepped up to the microphone. "And now," he announced, "we'd like to hear from someone who's been there from the very beginning. Someone who helped build this foundation alongside David. Please welcome to the stage, Mrs. Catherine Sterling." The applause was polite but uncertain. David went pale. Jessica's smile completely disappeared. I stood up and walked to the stage, each step calm and measured. When I reached the microphone, I looked out at the sea of faces, all watching me, waiting to see what I would do. I smiled. A real smile this time. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady and clear. "It's been a while since I've stood in front of all of you. The last time I was in a room like this with people I thought were friends, something hot was served. But it wasn't the food that burned. It was the humiliation. You could hear people shift in their seats. The room went absolutely silent. That night," I continued, "I learned something valuable. When people think they're above you, when they treat you like you don't matter, you have two choices. You can fight them, scream at them, demand they see your worth. Or you can do something much more powerful." I paused, letting the words sink in. You can step back and watch them climb so high on their own arrogance that when they fall, everyone sees it happen. More silence. I glanced at David. His face was frozen, expressionless. Jessica was staring at the floor. Tonight, we're here to celebrate excellence, I said. But excellence isn't just about money or buildings or having your name on a foundation. Real excellence is how you treat people when no one's watching. It's having integrity when it's easier to lie. It's choosing grace when you have every right to be angry. My voice got softer but somehow more powerful. So I want to raise a glass tonight. Not to money, not to success, but to something that can't be bought, faked, or performed. To dignity. To the quiet strength of people who rise not by stepping on others, but by refusing to sink to their level. I lifted my glass and slowly, almost hesitantly, people throughout the room did the same. The applause started small, just a few people clapping, but then it grew. It became thunderous, people standing up, genuinely moved by what I'd said. I handed the microphone back to the host and walked off the stage. I didn't look at David. I didn't look at Jessica. I just walked straight through the ballroom and out onto the balcony, where the city lights spread out below me like 1,000 second chances. Behind me, I could hear the room buzzing with conversation. People were no longer celebrating David. They were talking about me, about what I'd said, about the video someone was probably already posting online. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see David standing there, looking smaller somehow, less certain. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him for a long moment. This man I'd spent 7 years loving, supporting, believing in. This stranger wearing my husband's face. "I didn't do anything," I said calmly. "I just told the truth. You did the rest to yourself. You're trying to ruin me." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm just done protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. There's a difference." He had no response to that. What could he say? I turned back to look at the city. "You can go back to your party, David. I'm sure Jessica is looking for you." He stood there for another moment, then walked away. And for the first time in 7 years, I felt completely free. By morning, my speech had gone viral. I woke up to dozens of messages from friends, family, even people I barely knew. The video had been shared thousands of times with captions like "the classiest takedown ever," and "this is how you win with grace." News outlets were calling it the most powerful moment of the year. Relationship podcasters were analyzing it. Social media was filled with people sharing their own stories of quiet strength and choosing dignity over drama. I didn't watch any of it. I didn't need to. I'd said what I needed to say, and now it was time to move forward. David's world crumbled faster than even I expected. Within 2 weeks, 3 major investors pulled out of his projects. The board of his own foundation called an emergency meeting to discuss his leadership. Sponsors who'd supported him for years quietly distanced themselves, releasing statements about realigning their values. Jessica disappeared from public view entirely. Someone told me she deleted all her social media accounts and left Chicago. I never confirmed it because honestly, I didn't care. She'd been a symptom of the problem, not the problem itself. David tried calling me several times. I never answered. He sent emails that I deleted without reading. He even showed up at the house once, but I had the locks changed, and the security guard turned him away. My lawyer contacted his lawyer, and we began divorce proceedings quietly, without drama, without a public fight. I didn't want his money or his buildings or his empire. I just wanted my freedom and my name back. 6 months after that gala, I was sitting in my new apartment, a modest but beautiful place in a quiet neighborhood with windows that actually let in sunlight. I was having coffee with Rachel, my oldest friend, who'd stuck by me through everything. "So what now?" she asked, smiling. "You've got the whole world watching. What's next for Catherine Sterling?" "Not Sterling," I corrected gently. "I'm going back to my maiden name. Catherine Reed." She raised her coffee cup. "To Catherine Reed, then. What's her next chapter?" I thought about that question for a long time. For years, I'd defined myself by my relationship to David, by my role as his wife. But who was I beyond that? What did I actually want? The answer came to me clearly, like it had been waiting all along. "I want to help other women," I said. "Women who feel invisible, who've lost themselves in someone else's story. I want to show them that you don't have to burn everything down to rise again. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to stay down." Rachel's eyes lit up. "Like a foundation? Or a support group?" "Maybe both," I said, ideas already forming in my mind. A place where women can rebuild, learn their worth again, start businesses, find their voices. Not by tearing anyone down, but by building themselves up. 3 months later, I opened the Phoenix Center. It wasn't fancy or expensive or exclusive. It was a warm, welcoming space in the heart of the city where women could come for workshops, counseling, business mentoring, or just coffee and conversation with people who understood what it felt like to start over. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, we had a waiting list. Women came from all over Chicago, some escaping bad relationships, others just lost and looking for direction. They came because they'd seen my story and knew I understood their struggle. I didn't talk about David anymore. This wasn't about him. It was about all of us, everyone who'd ever felt small and decided to become bigger. One afternoon, a young woman came to the Phoenix Center. She was maybe 27, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, eyes that looked tired and scared. "I saw your speech online," she said quietly. "The one at the gala. I've watched it probably 50 times. What did you see in it?" I asked gently. She looked down at her hands. "I saw someone who didn't let them win. Someone who didn't fight back with anger, but with something stronger. I'm trying to leave my boyfriend, and everyone tells me I should key his car or post his secrets online or make him pay. But that's not who I am." I reached across and took her hand. "Then don't. You don't have to become cruel to prove you're strong. Sometimes walking away with your dignity intact is the greatest victory of all." She started crying then, and I sat with her, letting her feel what she needed to feel. That's when I knew this was exactly where I was supposed to be. A year after the gala, I was invited back to that same venue for a different event, a fundraiser for women's shelters. As I stood on that same stage where I'd given my speech, I looked out at a room full of people who now saw me as someone who'd turned pain into purpose. A year ago, I stood on this stage and talked about dignity and grace. Tonight, I want to talk about what comes after. Because survival isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. I told them about the Phoenix Center, about the women who'd walked through our doors carrying the weight of their past and left carrying hope for their future. I told them that healing isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet daily work. It's choosing yourself again and again until it becomes natural. The applause that night was different from before. It wasn't about witnessing a takedown or enjoying drama. It was about recognizing real transformation. As I left the stage, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, complete peace. David didn't destroy me. He didn't even come close. He just revealed what was already inside me all along. The strength to walk away, the wisdom to let karma do its work, and the grace to build something beautiful from the ashes of what broke. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But I learned something better. The sweetest revenge is no revenge at all. It's living so well that they become irrelevant to your story. That night, standing in front of that room, I wasn't David Sterling's ex-wife anymore. I was Catherine Reed, a woman who rose quietly, powerfully, and on her own terms. And that, I realized, was worth more than any victory I could have fought for. Because when you stop needing them to fall, you've already won.